At 600 pounds, the world shrank to the size of my living room. I could name every stain on the carpet, every crack in the ceiling paint, every nick in the arm of the chair where I spent most of my life. The house became a map of limitations. The hallway that narrowed like a throat, the bathroom door that only opened partway, the bedroom where the mattress had sagged in the middle like a small canyon. Outside felt like a rumor I'd stopped paying attention to. I could hear life happening beyond the walls, neighbors laughing, cars moving, and there was a part of me that started to believe those sounds were for other people. People ask how it gets that far. Like weight is a single decision rather than a slow, complicated chorus of choices, comforts, griefs, and time. For me, it began like it does for a lot of people. Food as consolation, then habit, then the only reliable pleasure left after other things fell away. My mother's cooking was church and safety. It was the only language my family spoke when words were too expensive. As bills piled up and temp jobs came and went, the stove was a steady presence. It felt unfair to call it my enemy. There were other forces too. Injuries that made moving harder, friendships that dissolved into text messages, nights when sleep felt impossible and the refrigerator was the only place of quiet. My days shortened: wake, eat, scroll, sleep. Sometimes I told myself that I was researching, learning about diets and exercises, and other times I was simply surviving another day. The pounds arrived like weather, gradual, unremarkable, then undeniably there. When you live with a body that large, the ordinary acts of living become obstacles. Getting dressed took strategy. Finding chairs that would hold me was its own adventure. I remember the first time a restaurant brought over a reinforced chair, and the way the server's face revealed both sympathy and awkwardness. Little humiliations collected like pebbles in my shoes. I learned to avoid places where stairs were unavoidable. I learned to enter through side doors, to choose aisles in stores that allowed me to turn without shame. I became excellent at steering my life around possibility. Still, there were pockets of normalcy. My sister would call for Sunday dinners, and in those moments the house smelled like roast and laughter, and for a few hours the scale and the shame seemed distant. My nephew would climb into my lap and fall asleep, and I would hold him and feel, briefly, less heavy in the only sense that mattered. Love never left me, but love alone could not lift me out of the habit I had constructed brick by brick. The day the ambulance came is carved into my memory like an emergency cut. I woke to a pressure in my chest that didn't let go, the kind that makes you sit up and listen. At first I thought it was indigestion, then anxiety, then a heaviness that made breathing shallow and mechanical. I tried to stand and my knees buckled as if I had been betrayed by my own bones. My phone was on the floor 2 feet away and reaching for it felt as impossible as climbing a mountain. I called out for help, and my voice sounded like a distant echo in the room. When the paramedics arrived, they moved with the calm urgency of people who have practiced this choreography 1,000 times. I gave them my name between breaths, and one of them checked my pulse while another assessed my breathing. "We need to get you out of the house," the lead medic said, gentle but firm. I remember thinking, absurdly, about the humiliating images, being carried out, strangers around my bed, the neighborhood watching. I wanted privacy, dignity, and escape from spectacle. The reality, however, was that I had reached a physical limit. The EMTs consulted with their dispatcher and then, to my shock, the fire department arrived with equipment I had only seen in movies. Heavy-duty straps, a reinforced stretcher, and then, even more incongruously, a small forklift driven by a firefighter in reflective gear. For a moment it felt like a scene meant for other people. Oversized props in a tragedy movie, until I realized I was the protagonist. Neighbors gathered at the end of the driveway, not in a cruel way, but in that human way people do when something dramatic passes by their window. I felt exposed in layers. My body, my choices, my private failures laid out in public with sirens muffled and hoses still rolled up on trucks. The parole of my humiliation was made worse by the practicalities of it. The doorway was too narrow to carry me sideways, so the plan was engineered with a kind of mechanical precision I had never considered for my body. They did it with respect. The firefighters and paramedics worked like a team of careful surgeons, speaking softly as they designed the lift. Straps were positioned beneath me while I lay on the reinforced board, hands shaking not just from fear but from the realization that this was now the threshold between staying and leaving. A firefighter placed a gloved hand on my shoulder and said, "We're going to move you safe and slow." His voice anchored me. As the forklift's forks slid under the stretcher, there was a surreal tilt between the ordinary and the absurd. I felt my body shift from heavy to fixture, measured in bolts and balance. The machine hummed and rose, and for a moment the house swam below me like the opening scene of a life I had not been invited to watch for years. The sensation was neither graceful nor cinematic. It was functional and terrifying and oddly tender. The forklift carried me down the side of the house, past a window where my mother stood with her hands at her mouth, and onto the stretcher where two paramedics braced me as they would a fragile patient. No one laughed. No one pointed. They treated me like someone they were determined to save. The ride in the ambulance was a blur of beeping and clipped questions. Previous conditions, medications, allergies. I answered as best I could. Breath came, but it was a workmanlike thing. At the hospital, they wheeled me into a fluorescent corridor and handed me over to doctors I would later learn to respect and fear. Monitors were attached with the same quiet professionalism as the straps at home. Tests were run. My heart had been under siege for a long time. Lungs sounded congested. Blood sugar told a story of neglect. Sitting on the hospital bed, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and a faint lemon cleaner, reality became clearer in ways that embarrassed me and steadied me at the same time. The doctor spoke of risks in a language that was not meant to shame but to inform. Cardiac stress, respiratory failure, immobility complications, the way joints gave out under constant pressure. He used words like critical and urgent, and mapped out a list of interventions that ranged from therapy to the possibility of bariatric procedures. None of it was presented as a miracle fix. It was, he emphasized, a program. "We can help you make a plan," he said. "But the first thing is that you know where you stand." What I heard was simpler. I had become a problem for my body and for the people who loved me. To them, this was not a moral failing. To me, it felt like a headline. The forklift had been the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I had been writing with my days. It was humiliating, yes, but also clarifying. The world had not stopped delivering consequences because I chose to ignore them. When I called my sister from the hospital, her voice a mixture of alarm and fierce worry, I could hear the relief in her breath when I said I was alive. "You scared us," she said. There was no sermon, only human concern. That night, as I lay awake with monitors ticking, I thought about the neighbors, about the firefighter's hand on my shoulder, about my nephew's small face when he jumped into my lap years ago. Those images stitched together in a way that made the next decision obvious. I would not become a permanent news story, a cautionary tale carried by a forklift. If survival was the first requirement, then living fully again would be the second. It felt impossible and immediate, like asking an ocean to recede one wave at a time. The doctor set me up with a care team, nutrition, physical therapy, counseling, and consultations about potential surgical options. They explained step by step what could be done, but it was not enough for me to hear strategies. I needed to make a personal promise. In the quiet between monitor beeps, I spoke it aloud. "I will try. I will do the work." It was small and shivering, but it was the first sentence of a different story. The weeks that followed were a blur of hospital routines, weigh-ins, diet charts, blood pressure checks, and endless talks about calorie deficits and portion control. But underneath the medical jargon, I felt something begin to shift inside me. For the first time in years, people weren't looking at me like I was a mistake. They were looking at me like I was someone who still had a chance. The first step was physical therapy, and that's where I truly met myself again. My therapist, a tough but kind woman named Angela, looked me straight in the eye on the first day and said, "You're going to hate me sometimes, but I promise, if you trust me, you'll walk again without pain." I didn't know whether to believe her. I could barely stand for 2 minutes without feeling dizzy. But she was right. Each day began with small movements. Lifting my arms, turning my ankles, learning to breathe properly. It felt humiliating to celebrate something so basic, but every motion became a victory. When I took my first unassisted step with her help, I cried. Not from pain, but from the strange joy of remembering what progress felt like. I had lived so long in stagnation that even small victories felt enormous. Angela didn't celebrate loudly. She just smiled and said, "That's how it starts." And she was right. My sister visited every evening after work, bringing me soup or homemade food that actually fit the doctor's plan. She'd sit beside my hospital bed, holding my hand as we talked about the past. The moments I'd missed, the birthdays I'd skipped, the photos I avoided. "We just want you back," she said one night softly. "Not some perfect version. Just you." That sentence broke something open in me. For years, I thought I needed to disappear to be accepted again. But what she wanted was presence, not perfection. After a month, I was cleared to go home, but home looked different now. The forklift wasn't needed this time. The team had made sure I could walk short distances, using reinforced crutches and support rails. My front door was widened by a local charity after hearing about my case on the news, and for the first time in months, I stepped through it on my own 2 feet. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't easy, but it was mine. At home, the struggle continued, maybe even harder than before. Hospitals give you schedules and supervision. Home gives you temptation and silence. My old habits whispered constantly. The comfort foods, the long nights with no movement. I deleted all my delivery apps the first night back. It felt like a breakup, deleting my old best friends and worst enemies at once. The hardest part was the loneliness. Healing is lonely work, especially when you've spent years avoiding mirrors and public places. But I filled the silence with small rituals, preparing meals that actually nourished me, keeping a gratitude notebook, celebrating each pound lost not as punishment, but as proof of consistency. I started sharing short posts on social media about my journey, half expecting no one to care. To my surprise, people responded. Some were strangers thanking me for my honesty. Others were old friends who admitted they had silently worried about me for years. Their words reminded me that stories heal, not just the teller, but the listener too. 3 months later, I joined a local support group for people struggling with obesity. Walking into that community center the first day was terrifying. I expected judgment. Instead, I found connection. There were people from all walks of life, a retired teacher, a young college student, even a former athlete who had gained weight after an injury. We shared meals, workouts, and tears. The group became my lifeline. I learned that transformation isn't a straight line. It's a messy graph filled with relapses, wins, and do-overs. There were weeks when I lost 10 pounds and others when I gained 2 back. But instead of quitting, I learned to forgive myself and keep going. That forgiveness, not the scale, was the true marker of change. 6 months after that first hospital admission, my doctor called me in for a checkup. When he entered the room, he did a double take. "You look different," he said, smiling. I had lost over 150 pounds. My blood pressure had normalized. My sleep apnea had improved. For the first time in my adult life, my test results didn't look like a crisis report. He asked me what changed, and I told him the truth. I stopped waiting for motivation. I started working even when I hated it. The local news ran a small segment about my progress, and people I didn't even know started messaging me online. One message stood out, from a young man who said he was over 500 pounds and too embarrassed to leave his house. "Seeing your story made me believe maybe I can change too," he wrote. I sat staring at that message for a long time. I realized that maybe this was the real reason I'd survived. To remind someone else that it's not too late. A year later, I weighed 320 pounds, still overweight but no longer imprisoned by it. I could walk without a cane, drive my car again, even go shopping in person. But the biggest victory was emotional. The shame that once kept me isolated had started to dissolve. I could look at people in the eyes again. I could look in mirrors without flinching. One afternoon, I stood outside in my front yard, the same yard I'd once been lifted out of by a forklift. The sun was warm, the grass freshly cut. My nephew came running toward me, yelling, "Uncle, race me." I laughed, and for the first time in years I did. I ran. Not far, not fast, but enough to feel the wind on my face. Enough to feel alive. Now, whenever I share my story, I don't talk about numbers or diets. I talk about the moment when I realized I deserved better. Not thinner, not prettier, not perfect, just better. I talk about the forklift not as humiliation, but as the turning point that forced me to face myself. It wasn't the machine that carried me out, it was the wake-up call that carried me forward. So if you're listening to this, and you feel trapped inside your own body, I want you to know something. You are not hopeless. You are not broken beyond repair. You may need help, maybe even a forklift moment of your own, but that's not the end of your story. It's the beginning of the one where you finally decide to live. And if one day, years from now, you find yourself standing outside again, breathing freely, don't forget to look back. Not with shame, but with pride. Because the person who once couldn't leave the house was the same person strong enough to build a new life from that very doorway.